On the 10th of December 1996, former President Nelson Mandela signed the Constitution in Qhawe, a signature that would give birth to the Rainbow Nation, a nation that belongs to all who live in it, united in their diversity. On that day, South Africa made history as it became the first country in the entire world to constitutionally prohibit unfair discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. To understand the significance of this, one has to look at the Constitution itself, what it is, or at least what it ought to be. It is the supreme law of the land, above all other laws, persons, conduct, and all government branches and organs. Thus, anything inconsistent with the Constitution is legally invalid. South Africa made history again within a decade as it became the first African country to legalize same-sex marriage through the Civil Union Act of 2006. Thus, South Africa has been dubbed as the most gay-friendly country on the continent. Today, it is 2022, nearly 30 years since the Constitution was signed into effect. And what is certain is that whoever that Rainbow Nation belongs to, it does not include the LGBTQIA+ community. Hello, I am Qhawe. Ndingumxhosa, ndiyindoda, isitabane. I am Xhosa, I'm a man, and I'm gay. Sorry, some people might not understand. Forgive me. Gay. A faggot, sissy, morphe, what have you, it's up to you really. But personally, I prefer the term human, mainly because I'm just as capable of loving, hurting, disappointing, being disappointed, aspiring, inspiring, and all the other things an average human being is capable of. I believe I am just as capable. And this particular average human being wants us today to look at the history of the LGBTQIA+ community, our struggle for human dignity, the challenges faced by our community both in the country and the rest of the continent, our victories and the heroes who've helped us get there. But ultimately, I want us to somehow answer the question of where to next, as is the theme of today's talk. So, according to Leah Barkle in an article titled African Sexuality and the Legacy of Imported Homophobia, there's a direct relationship between the British colonies and anti-gay legislation. I'm reminded of the story of King Mwanga, the second of Buganda, or what is today Uganda. Mwanga was the 31st and last monarch of Buganda, believed to have about 16 wives, a true African man, you would say. But I argue that what made him even more African is the fact that he was also known to have had homosexual relations with his male pages, something similar to a servant. Interestingly, it was tradition at the time in Buganda for a reigning monarch to select any man or woman to fulfill their sexual desires. However, by the time Mwanga became king, Christian missionaries had penetrated Buganda with European colonialists seeking to replace indigenous values with Christian values. Thus, many of Mwanga's male pages began to defy his sexual advances, claiming that they were either sinful, immoral, or anti-Christ. Now, it is important, before we go anywhere, that I stress Mwanga was no saint. He, in fact, killed many of his subjects that stubbornly converted to Christianity. Moreover, this is not an attempt to claim Mwanga as the black gay hero of Africa or some anti-colonialist role model we should be looking up to. But there are three important things about the story of Mwanga in relation to homosexuality and Africa. One, homosexuality in Africa has existed before colonialism. Two, homosexuality in Africa has been accepted, with varying degrees of course, and even included in the cultural design of communities. Thirdly, homophobic sentiments in Africa began to intensify with colonialism and the spread of Christianity on the continent. For example, when Ugandan Member of Parliament David Bahati introduced an anti-gay piece of legislation around 2013, he justified his motives, and to quote him, Uganda is a Christian country. Now, South Africa was not unique. Sorry. Back in South Africa, homophobia evolved from a mere social phenomenon to a state-endorsed form of discrimination through the Immorality Act, Amendment Act of 1957. Now, this act effectively punished being gay or any form of homosexual activity. The late anti-apartheid described the decades that followed suit after the enactment of this legislation. His name is Simon Ngoli. Ngoli says in an interview, "The black community is the most hostile towards men who are homosexual. Lots of people commit suicide, run away from their families, or just disappear, and no one knows what happens to them. Because the only choice you have as a black gay man to avoid being persecuted by other black people, by your own family, is to get married against your own choice, which more often than not leads to unhappy families, if ultimately it will not be a divorce." Now, South Africa was not unique in enacting legislation that not only prohibits same-sex marriage, but the activity of homosexual intercourse itself. As we speak today, there are nearly 72 countries that still penalize being gay, nearly 30 of which are African countries. In countries like Nigeria, being gay is punishable by up to 14 years of imprisonment, with some countries going as far as recommending the death penalty by public stoning. Many African leaders still argue that homosexuality does not exist in Africa. Yet, ironically, they still go on to enact legislation that somehow punishes or regulates being gay. Which brings us to this question. If the thing does not exist, what then is your law trying to respond to? What are you trying to regulate? Even more intriguing, to me at least, is how government officials are so obsessed and invested in what I do with my penis or anus. Do they want to join us, perhaps? I mean, would welcome them with open arms. That's a shame. Fortunately for the LGBTQIA+ community in South Africa, we were blessed by the likes of Palesa Beblididzi and that of Simon. See, Palesa and Simon were among those who organized the first ever Pride March in South Africa. They also went on to negotiate with ANC leaders to ensure that LGBTQIA+ interests were reflected on the Bill of Rights and ultimately the Constitution, as I've said. In fact, Palesa Beblididzi was the first person ever to confront the United Nations World Conference on issues pertaining to lesbian women. Since, our Constitutional Court has made historical judgments in favor of these interests. However, the beautiful law that South Africa is praised for is struggling to translate from paper to reality. Story time. Back in March, I went home for something called Mkebe. So for those of you who do not know, Mkebe is a celebration of a Xhosa young man who has been successfully initiated by circumcision. My ex-boyfriend would ask, without anesthesia? To which I would reply, pain is the essence of being a Xhosa man. Now, at Mkebe, my cousin and I observed this woman, or at least female-bodied person, who's quite masculine presenting, from their mannerisms, their style of clothing, downright to the way they speak. My cousin goes, why is she trying so hard to be a man? It's ridiculous and disgusting. Ugh. Months later, I go for the same event, but this time Mthatha for a friend. Now on the way there, I come across a group of taxi drivers, and I'm in fact inquiring as to how do you catch a taxi from my hometown, Tsofimvaba, to Mthatha? The response goes, why are you wearing those things? Have you ever seen a man in public with earphones on? You look ridiculous and like a girl. See, the anti-toxic masculinity in me and the law undergrad that I am was ready to pounce with a counter-argument in defense of my manhood, my pride, my masculinity, what have you. It's just that I could not help but feel insecure in that very moment. Mainly because as they're speaking, I have Beyonce on pause, and she's calling for ladies to information, and I am downright information. Just don't think it would have been a good argument in that particular point in time. To reiterate the question, why is the law struggling to translate from paper to reality? Author and professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Qhawe says, South Africa is a patriarchal society, which means effeminate gay men, or at least male-bodied persons like this one, are believed to be betraying their superiority that comes with being male. And that those women, like the one who observed, or at least female-bodied person, like the one who observed Edumkidwan, are believed to be trying to usurp or challenge or threaten the superiority that comes with being male. So it leads us to this profound question. How do we change the discourse from one that pathologizes homosexuality or seeks to punish those who do not conform to the current gender norms, to the one that embraces diversity, calls for inclusivity, for the sake that each of us deserve dignified lives, regardless of our inconsequential differences? Well, I'll have to be honest at this point. I do not have the full comprehensive answer, and even if I did, I would speak here for hours on end, which I believe is not the nature of these talks. In any case, Mkebe then goes on to suggest that the work of undoing negative attitudes toward sexuality and gender need to be undertaken at every social level, particularly in education. Minister of Basic Education Qhawe found that in 38 textbooks, LGBTQIA+ people were only mentioned twice. I myself, in subjects like history, have never been taught of any LGBTQIA+ historical figure. While on the other hand, I was taught of Adolf Hitler at least, say, 3 times. Nelson Mandela, I have lost count at this point. In subjects like life orientation, where we mainly get our sex education, we find that the sex education is mainly taught to cater for the cisgendered and heterosexual individuals in the classroom. For those of you in the audience who are not gay or in any way part of the LGBTQIA+ community, by show of hands, how many of you know of the following terms? Top, bottom, versatile, side, douching, lube, 500 meters away. Seeing some homophobes here. Now, these terms are like second nature, rather everyday language for a gay man specifically, and they relate to their sexual lifestyle. Now, you would assume that something so intrinsic to one's sexual health would be included in the school curriculum, but no. Instead, queer individuals have to find this information either from media or from peers, which I hope we can all agree is not the best source of information around topics of sexual health. While on the other hand, the lack of inclusions around topics of sexuality and gender in our classroom further emphasize the stigma of those very same topics. So ultimately what we need from the government as the law and policymaker is to start acting affirmatively. That is to say, to stop merely punishing those who are overtly queerphobic and transphobic and homophobic, and that long list of phobias we have, but to actually start taking positive measures towards addressing those past injustices that are now echoing in the Rainbow Nation. So, for instance, in the school environment, we must be taught of King Mwanga II. We must know of the contributions of Palesa Beverly Dite and that of Simon Goli towards the liberation of LGBTQIA plus people. We must have an inclusive sex education. But I think even more broadly, we need to start looking at patriarchy with the same sense of urgency and passion we have for issues pertaining to race. Now, in doing so, we are in no way trying to remove the seriousness of racial inequality and discrimination, but rather, we're adding another lens through which we can understand inequality in our society. Kimberly Crenshaw is famous for coining this approach as intersectionality. So in essence, we stop looking at, say, race as being one problem, gender inequality, another problem, class division may be a separate issue. Rather, we start looking at them as being overlapping and sometimes even intertwined. Because the dangerous consequence of trying to distinguish them so much is that we end up prioritizing them differently. I'll give you an example. In 2021, the first day of the academic year at the University of Cape Town was cancelled due to students protesting against fee blocks. So what we're observing here is students retaliating against being unjustly denied their right to education on the basis of race and class. But commonly, race is cited as being the underpinning issue. Months later, in April, Andile Luluntu is killed in the Eastern Cape. Homophobically motivated. It is in fact one of many that occurred during the 2021 period. Yet when it is time to mobilize and demonstrate outside the South African Parliament, which was roughly, say, 5 kilometers from here, the same vigor, the same passion, the anger of a Black life lost, the blocking of roads, the disruption of classes, the Instagram posts and radical Twitter tweets you witness with issues such as fee blocks suddenly disappear. Friends, acquaintances who have nothing to lose, I emphasize, nothing to lose, by showing up and demonstrating for justice, demonstrating for Andile, suddenly have other priorities that prevent them from doing so. So because we see race as being the only form by which one can be oppressed, we end up losing another Black life, another Black queer life. More intriguing is that we end up even conflicting our values. Because how can we fight so passionately for the right to education when that of life itself has not been secured? Before I leave, allow me to introduce myself once more. I am BC Alimi, exiled from my own country of birth, Nigeria, because I had enough courage and boldness to come out on national television and become a gay activist. I was David Gato Kisule, and I was murdered for being foolish enough, apparently, to dare think that Ugandan gay people and the rest of the LGBTQIA plus community deserve to live dignified lives. On a sweeter note, I'm also Yamgela Mavela, a loving friend who's dedicated at serving students, all the while securing a spot on the DIN's merit list. I'm Edward Fungai, a calm baby who always puts the needs of others before that of their own, who, I'm not sure if you've noticed, is an exceptional violinist. I am Sibusiso Mazomba, a relentless climate change activist who has traveled and protested around the world to save humanity from an apocalypse. I don't think you understand me quite well. I said I am Thamsanqa Makiling, an amazing radio and television personality. For me, working with the likes of, say, Trevor Noah, Beyonce, is inevitable. Oh. Before I forget, turns out I didn't know this. I am also Qhawe Mkebe. This is the part where you take time to look at me. Look at me, I'm gorgeous. Well, I think the best way to describe me is that I'm just another black Xhosa faggot who is determined to fight to the depths of hell to ensure that LGBTQIA+ people get to realize their aspirations without being limited by their gender or sexual orientation.